Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a name that has echoed through the halls of the Imperial Palace for more than 10,000 years. A name spoken in reverence by those golden warriors who stand eternal vigil over the master of mankind. A name whispered in the deepest, most guarded archives of the Imperium, where only the most trusted servants are permitted to tread. And yet, for all its fame, for all the weight it carries across the millennia, this name belongs to a figure who remains one of the most profound enigmas in the entire history of the Imperium of man. That name is Constantin Valdor. He was called the Emperor's Spear, the first of the 10,000, the shield of the Emperor, chief custodian and captain general of the Legio Custodes, the most elite fighting force ever assembled by human hands. Yet he was a warrior whose martial prowess was so extraordinary that men and women of the imperial court dared to call him Primarch in all but name. He stood shoulder to shoulder with beings that were crafted to be demigods, and he did not flinch. He did not falter. He held his ground as their equal, and in some ways, perhaps, as something more. And then, in the aftermath of the greatest catastrophe the Imperium had ever known, after the Siege of Terror had shattered the dream of unity and the Emperor had been sealed upon the Golden Throne, Constantin Valdor simply vanished. He resigned his position. He gathered his weapons and his armor, artifacts that should have been placed reverently in the Hall of Armaments to be remembered forever, and he walked away from the Imperial Palace, from the world he had helped build, from the Emperor he had sworn to protect above all else. He offered no explanation. He left no farewell, yet he vanished from imperial history as though he had never existed at all, leaving behind nothing but questions and silence and 10,000 years of mystery. This is the story of that man, if indeed man is the right word for what Constantin Valdor truly was. This is the story of his origins, shrouded in darkness, of his rise to become the most trusted warrior in the Emperor's service, of the wars he waged, and the terrible secrets he carried, as of the choices he made when the galaxy was burning around him, and of the haunting possibility that even now, after all these centuries, the story of Constantin Valdor is not yet finished, not by a long way. So settle in, get comfortable, let the noise of the world fade away for a while, and let us travel together across 10,000 years of history to find the truth buried beneath layers of myth and legend, and carefully maintained silence. Let us find Constantin Valdor, as a child stolen from darkness. The origins of Constantin Valdor are wrapped in the kind of deliberate obscurity that the Imperium has always been so skilled at manufacturing. The official records are sparse, contradictory, and often classified beyond the reach of even senior imperial historians. What little we know comes to us in fragments, like shards of a broken mirror, each one reflecting a slightly different version of the same elusive truth. What we can say with some certainty is this: long before the Primarchs were even conceived, long before the great genetic laboratories beneath the Himalayan peaks hummed with the energy of creation, the Emperor of mankind was searching for something, or rather, someone. According to Amara Astarte, the brilliant and troubled scientist whose very name would later be given to the Space Marine program, the Emperor moved entire armies across continents to locate and retrieve a single child. This was not a casual effort. This was not a footnote in the larger campaign of the Unification Wars. This was a deliberate, focused, and enormously costly operation undertaken by the most powerful being on the face of old Earth, all for the sake of one infant. That child was Constantin Valdor. The Emperor, according to Astarte's account, had Valdor's original parents killed in the process of claiming him. Whether this was a necessary consequence of the retrieval or a deliberate act of severance, cutting the child free from any earthly attachment before his transformation began, we cannot know. What we do know is that Valdor himself remembers almost nothing of his life before entering the Emperor's service. His memories of who he was, of who his parents were, of what kind of world he was born into, all of it was either taken from him or simply faded beneath the weight of what he became. Think about that for a moment. The Emperor, a being who had walked the earth for thousands upon thousands of years, who had seen civilizations rise and crumble to dust, who had watched the birth of gods and the death of stars. This being looked upon a helpless infant and saw something so extraordinary, so uniquely valuable, that he was willing to wage war to possess it. What did he see? What quality burned so brightly in that child that the Emperor would not rest until he held it in his hands? We may never know the answer, but the implications are staggering. It suggests that Valdor was not simply raw material to be shaped into a weapon. It suggests that there was something inherent in his nature, something written into the very fabric of his being that made him essential to the Emperor's plans. The Custodians were the Emperor's masterwork in genetic engineering, each one a unique creation wrought with painstaking care and precision far beyond anything the Astartes process could achieve. But even among the Custodians, Valdor was different. He was the first among them, or at least the first to survive the process, and the distinction between those two possibilities is itself a fascinating mystery. Valdor himself was uncertain on this point. He could not recall whether he was truly the first Custodian ever created, or simply the first one who emerged from the Emperor's laboratories with his mind and body intact. The process of creating a Custodian was a thing of terrifying complexity. Unlike the Space Marines, who were forged through a relatively standardized system of organ implantation and genetic modification applied to adolescent recruits, the Custodians were crafted from infancy. The Emperor's techniques worked at the most fundamental level of human biology, rewriting the genetic code itself, reshaping the very building blocks of life with a precision and depth that bordered on the miraculous. Many candidates did not survive this process. Many were driven mad, their minds unable to bear the strain of transformation that began before they could even speak their own names. The creation of a single Custodian was an investment of time, resources, and the Emperor's personal attention that dwarfed anything required to produce an Astartes. Each Custodian was a singular masterpiece, an individual work of art in a medium of flesh and bone and engineered perfection. And Valdor was the first of these masterpieces, the prototype upon which all others were modeled and measured. The result was a being of supernatural stature and grace. Valdor stood eye to eye with the Primarchs themselves, those 20 demigods who would later be scattered across the galaxy by the machinations of the Chaos Gods. He possessed strength and speed that could match a Primarch in single combat, and a claim that was not empty boasting but a verified assessment shared by many who had witnessed him fight. His intellect was as formidable as his physical prowess, a mind honed to process tactical information, political intrigue, and philosophical complexity with equal ease. And through it all, there was a quality of stillness about him, a calm and watchful patience that made him seem less like a warrior and more like a sentinel carved from living gold, always watching, always measuring, always ready. But what truly set Valdor apart from the other Custodians, beyond his physical superiority and tactical genius, was something harder to define. It was a quality of absolute, unwavering purpose. He was not burdened by ambition, as so many of the Primarchs would be. He did not hunger for glory or recognition. He did not dream of empires or legacies. He existed for one reason and one reason alone: to serve the Emperor and to fulfill whatever duty that service demanded. And this was not the blind obedience of a programmed automaton. It was the conscious, deliberate choice of a being who understood exactly what he was and what he was for, and who had accepted that purpose with every fiber of his engineered soul. In the early years of his service, before the wars began in earnest, Valdor walked beside the Emperor through the construction of the Imperial Palace. He watched the vast halls take shape around him. Those enormous spaces designed not for the world as it was, but for the world the Emperor intended to create. The palace was being built for another age, its corridors and chambers so vast that no existing war machines could fill them, its walls reaching toward the heavens with a grandeur that bordered on the impossible. And Valdor stood within those empty halls and understood, perhaps better than anyone else alive, that everything he saw around him was a promise of what humanity could become if the Emperor's vision was realized. That vision would require sacrifice, it would require blood, it would require the kind of terrible, pragmatic decisions that history prefers to forget. And Constantin Valdor would be the instrument through which many of those decisions were carried out. His hands would be stained with deeds that no amount of golden armor could make clean. But he would do it anyway because the Emperor required it. And because Valdor understood something that most of the Imperium citizens could not, that the building of a paradise sometimes requires the willingness to commit acts that belong in hell. The blood of unification. The unification wars were the crucible in which the Imperium of man was forged, and Constantin Valdor was present at the hottest point of that crucible from the very beginning. Terra, or Old Earth as it was sometimes called, was not the gleaming throne world that later generations would come to know. It was a shattered, brutal place. The long night of the Age of Strife had reduced the birth world of humanity to a patchwork of warring techno-barbarian states, each one ruled by petty tyrants and warlords who clung to whatever fragments of lost technology they could scavenge from the ruins of a greater age. Some of these rulers commanded genetically altered warriors of their own. In others wielded weapons from the dark age of technology that could level cities. And all of them, without exception, were willing to fight to the death rather than surrender their power to the golden figure who had emerged from the wastes with an army of golden-clad giants at his side. It was into this maelstrom of violence and desperation that Valdor was sent, again and again, leading the Emperor's Custodian Guard into battles that would decide the fate of an entire world. One of the first major conflicts was the Battle of Moorland Sen, sometimes called the Battle of the Red Frost. This campaign in the frozen north, in the territories of the Nordic hives, was a test of everything the Emperor had built. The forces of the Moorland Sen Confederacy were formidable. Their leader, the Priest King, commanded an army of genetically altered warriors, psychically marked individuals, and fanatical zealots who followed him with the kind of devotion that comes only from a marriage of faith and terror. The Confederacy's forces outnumbered the Imperial army nearly 7-1. But the Emperor had brought his Thunder Warriors, those magnificent, savage, doomed creations who were the first of humanity's super soldiers. And alongside them marched Valdor with a small cadre of 30 custodians, their golden armor gleaming against the frozen landscape like scattered pieces of a shattered sun. The battle was fierce beyond description. The Priest King's warriors fought with the desperation of true believers defending their god, and the frozen earth ran red with the blood of thousands. But the Imperial forces prevailed. The Priest King was captured by the Custodians themselves, and according to the official records, he was executed by the Emperor in person. But there are other records, older and more carefully hidden, preserved in archives that few have ever seen. These records suggest a different ending. They say that it was not the Emperor who struck the killing blow, but one of his gold-clad custodians. Given Valdor's prominence in the campaign, given his role as the Emperor's sword, it is not difficult to imagine whose hand held the weapon that day. This was the pattern that would define Valdor's role throughout the Unification Wars. But he was not merely a battlefield commander, though he excelled in that role beyond measure. He was the Emperor's instrument of quiet, necessary violence. A handful of years after Moorland Sen, Valdor personally assassinated Koja Zu, the minister of the Anuatan Steppes, a political killing carried out with the precision of a surgeon and the cold efficiency of a man who understood that sometimes the death of one could spare the lives of thousands. And after killing the minister, Valdor claimed her young son for the Legio Custodes. That boy would grow up to become Ra Endymion, one of the most renowned custodians in history, a warrior whose deeds during the war within the Webway would echo across 10,000 years. But he began his journey as an orphan, taken from his murdered mother's side by the very man who had ended her life. There is something deeply unsettling about that, and something deeply human too. Valdor did not kill Koja Zu out of malice or cruelty. Yet he did it because the Emperor required it, and because the greater plan demanded it. And then he looked upon the child she had left behind and saw potential, saw a future that could be salvaged from the wreckage of that dark moment. It was an act of terrible pragmatism wrapped around a kernel of something that might, if you squinted hard enough, look almost like compassion. But the darkest chapter of the Unification Wars, the event that would cast the longest shadow over Valdor's legacy, all was what happened at Mount Ararat. The official Imperial chronicles tell us that the Thunder Warriors, those first super soldiers of the Emperor, died heroically in the final battle of the Unification Wars. The legendary Aric Tyrannus, known as the Lightning Bearer, is said to have raised the Emperor's banner at the moment of final victory before succumbing to his wounds. It is a stirring story, a tale of noble sacrifice that brought tears to the eyes of the faithful for generations. And it was, as in almost every detail, a lie. The truth was far uglier. The Thunder Warriors had served their purpose. They had been created to conquer terror, and they had done so magnificently. But they were flawed creations, engineered in haste from adult subjects, rather than the careful infant-stage modification used for the Custodians. Their bodies were breaking down. Their minds were deteriorating. The genetic instabilities that had always been a part of their nature were accelerating, thus driving many of them toward madness and uncontrollable violence. They were weapons that had outlived their usefulness, and the Emperor, with the cold calculus of a being who measured lives against the fate of an entire species, decided they had to go. The purge was carried out by the Custodians. Several hundred of them, led, according to most accounts, by Constantin Valdor himself. They were accompanied by several thousand prototype space marines of the First Legion, whilst the predecessors of the Dark Angels, warriors who were being deployed in live combat for the very first time. The Thunder Warriors, caught off guard, betrayed by the very forces they had fought alongside for decades, were slaughtered almost to the last. A few escaped. A handful went to ground, hiding among the teeming masses of Terra's population, like wolves in sheep's clothing. But the vast majority died at the hands of their golden-armored executioners on that blood-soaked mountain. Valdor carried this secret with him like a stone in his chest. He did not take pleasure in the killing. Even later, when surviving Thunder Warriors emerged to challenge him, when the ghosts of Mount Ararat returned to demand an accounting, Valdor showed no satisfaction in the violence that followed. During the palace coup, when Grand Provost Marshal Uwoma Kandawire attempted to arrest him and put him on trial for the massacre, when the Thunder Warrior General Ashotan led his surviving brothers in a desperate bid for revenge, Valdor first tried to convince them to stand down. He urged them to surrender. He did not want more blood. But when they refused, when diplomacy failed and steel became the only language left, Valdor did what he had always done. He fulfilled his duty. He slew Ashotan in personal combat, an act that brought him no joy, for he had respected the old general, had admired his skill and his courage. And then, in a moment of mercy that seems almost out of character for a being so wholly dedicated to ruthless efficiency, Valdor spared Kandawire. He let her walk away from the palace, allowed her to retire in peace, when every protocol and every pragmatic calculation said she should have been eliminated. Why? We can only speculate. Perhaps even the Emperor's perfect weapon had limits. Perhaps even Constantin Valdor needed to prove, if only to himself, that he was still capable of choosing mercy when duty did not absolutely require death, the nature of what Valdor truly was. Before we move forward in the timeline, before we follow Valdor from the blood-soaked soil of old Earth into the stars and the wars that would follow, it is worth pausing to understand exactly what kind of being he was. Because the Custodians are not simply bigger, stronger space marines. They are something fundamentally different. And understanding that difference is essential to understanding why Valdor mattered as much as he did, and why his eventual departure was such a shattering event. The process of creating a space marine is, by the standards of the Imperium, relatively standardized. A candidate, typically an adolescent male selected for his physical and psychological suitability, is subjected to a series of surgeries that implant additional organs, derived from a primarch's genetic material, known as gene seed, as these organs enhance the candidate's strength, speed, endurance, and resilience far beyond human norms. The process is efficient enough to produce warriors in significant numbers, which is exactly what the Emperor needed for his galaxy-spanning crusade. Space Marines are, in essence, mass-produced transhuman soldiers, each one a formidable warrior, but each one essentially interchangeable with his brothers. The Custodians are created through an entirely different process. Where Space Marines are modified adolescents, Custodians are crafted from infancy. The Emperor's techniques do not merely add new organs to an existing biological framework. They rewrite the subject's genetic code at the most fundamental level, rebuilding the child from the ground up with a precision and thoroughness that the Astartes process cannot begin to approach. Each Custodian is a unique creation, individually tailored by artisans who answer to the Emperor himself. The process is extraordinarily time-consuming and resource-intensive, with many candidates failing to survive the transformation or being driven mad by the strain of such radical biological reconstruction. The result is a warrior who stands a full head taller than even the largest Space Marine, who possesses physical capabilities that exceed the Astartes in virtually every measurable dimension, and whose mental faculties are honed to a degree that makes even the most brilliant tactical minds of the Space Marine legions seem slow by comparison. A common saying within the Imperium holds that the Custodians are to Space Marines what Space Marines are to ordinary humans. This is not empty hyperbole. During the invasion of Prospero, small squads of Custodians were observed engaging and defeating groups of Thousand Sons that outnumbered them by significant margins, or even when the Astartes in question were employing their formidable psychic abilities. But the difference between Custodians and Space Marines goes deeper than mere physical or mental superiority. Space Marines, for all their genetic modification, retain much of their original personality and emotional capacity. They can form friendships, experience loyalty to their brothers in arms, feel anger and grief and pride. These emotions are muted, certainly, shaped and channeled by their training and their modifications, but they are still recognizably human in origin. Custodians are different. Their emotional landscape has been refined to such a degree that many observers have described them as being more and less than human simultaneously. They possess a depth of perception and understanding that exceeds ordinary human experience, but the range of emotions available to them has been narrowed and focused until it serves only their purpose. This is not to say that Custodians are emotionless machines. Far from it. The novels and lore make it clear that Custodians experience something that functions like emotion, though it may be qualitatively different from what ordinary humans feel. They can admire skill and courage. They can feel the weight of failure and the satisfaction of duty performed. They can recognize beauty and ugliness, justice and injustice, honor and disgrace, but all of these responses are filtered through the lens of their overriding purpose, the protection of the Emperor, and evaluated primarily in terms of how they relate to that purpose. Valdor was the apotheosis of this design philosophy. He was the most perfectly realized expression of the Emperor's vision for the Custodian Guard, a being in whom every biological process, every neural pathway, every aspect of his genetic architecture was tuned to the single, absolute frequency of service. Yes, when the lore describes Valdor as being unburdened by greed or ambition, it is not using metaphor. It is describing a literal quality of his genetic engineering, a deliberate absence of the drives and desires that motivate ordinary beings, replaced by a clarity of purpose so complete that it resembles a form of enlightenment. And yet, and this is the crucial point, Valdor was not a slave. The Custodians are not programmed automatons carrying out instructions without comprehension or choice. They are conscious, thinking, reasoning beings who serve the Emperor because they understand the importance of his mission and have consciously dedicated themselves to its fulfillment. The distinction is subtle but vital. A programmed machine cannot choose. A Custodian can. The fact that they invariably choose to serve does not diminish the significance of the choice. And it simply means that they have been crafted to see the world clearly enough that service appears to be the only rational response to what they see. This is what makes Valdor's eventual departure so devastating. When a being who was engineered for absolute loyalty, who possessed the intellectual capacity to understand the full implications of his choices, who had more reason than anyone else in the galaxy to remain faithful, when such a being chooses to walk away, it means something. It means that whatever he saw, whatever he learned, whatever the Apollonian spear showed him in those final desperate hours of the Siege of Terra, was powerful enough to overcome the most sophisticated genetic engineering in human history. It means that the truths he absorbed were so fundamental, so unavoidable, so utterly irreconcilable with his continued service, that even Constantin Valdor, the most loyal being in the Imperium, could not pretend they did not exist. That tells you something about the nature of those truths. Whatever the Apollonian spear revealed to Valdor, it was not a small thing. It was not a minor correction to his understanding of the world. It was something that shook the foundations of a consciousness that had been deliberately constructed to be unshakable, and that, more than any battlefield victory or political intrigue, now is what makes Constantin Valdor the most fascinating and most tragic figure in the entire history of the Imperium. The blood games and the Custodian way of war. One aspect of Custodian culture that Valdor personally championed deserves mention, for it reveals much about how he thought and how he trained his warriors to think. The blood games were a tradition unique to the Legio Custodes, a practice so secret that even many within the imperial palace were unaware of its existence. In a blood game, a custodian would be tasked with finding a way to breach the defenses of the imperial palace itself, using any means at his disposal, in order to identify weaknesses that could be exploited by the emperor's enemies. These were not simple exercises. A custodian engaged in a blood game might spend months, even years, living undercover in the underhive of Terra, building networks of contacts and acquiring resources, all to simulate what a determined and resourceful assassin might do in an attempt to reach the emperor. The custodian might adopt false identities, employ deception and subterfuge, and push the boundaries of his ingenuity to its absolute limits. And if he succeeded in finding a weakness, if he managed to penetrate the palace's defenses even theoretically, that weakness would be immediately identified and sealed. The blood games tell us something important about Valdor's philosophy of defense. That he was not content simply to build the strongest possible fortification and stand behind it. He understood that any defense, no matter how formidable, was only as strong as its weakest point, and that the most dangerous threats were the ones you had not anticipated. By constantly testing the palace's defenses from the perspective of a potential attacker, Valdor ensured that his warriors understood their enemy's thinking, their capabilities, and their likely approaches. And he turned the Custodian Guard into a force that was not merely reactive but proactive, constantly seeking out vulnerabilities before they could be exploited. This mindset, this relentless commitment to understanding and anticipating threats, would serve the Custodians well during the Horus Heresy, but it would also, perhaps, contribute to Valdor's eventual disillusionment. A man who has spent his life looking for weaknesses in his own defenses will eventually find them. And when the weakness he finds is not in a wall or a gate or a surveillance system, but in the very foundations of the cause he serves, the consequences are far more difficult to seal away. When Horus declared his rebellion, it was Amon Tauramachian, a custodian returning from an extended blood game, who first heard the news from Valdor himself. Tauramachian asked how such a thing could happen, how the most favored of the emperor's sons could turn against his father. And Valdor's response was characteristically measured and perceptive. He rejected the simple explanations, the theories of pride or resentment that others had offered. Instead, he voiced his belief that something had driven Horus and his closest advisors mad, that some external force had twisted the War Master's mind and turned him into something he had never been meant to become. Valdor saw, with the clarity that defined everything about him, That the heresy was not simply a political rebellion or a power struggle. It was something deeper, something more fundamental, something that struck at the very nature of reality itself. And he was right. He was always right. The tragedy was that being right was never enough to prevent the disaster from happening. Valdor assigned Tauromacchian to investigate Ferrom Sichar, the Lord of High Brazil, for evidence of treason. This was typical of Valdor's approach, quick, decisive, focused on gathering intelligence rather than making assumptions. While others debated and deliberated, Valdor acted. He identified potential threats, assigned his best people to investigate them, and prepared contingency plans for every possible outcome. It was the blood game philosophy applied to the greatest crisis in Imperial history, and it would serve the Imperium well in the desperate months and years that followed. The Triumvirate and the coming of the Primarchs. By the end of the Unification Wars, Constantin Valdor had become one of the three most powerful individuals on Terra. Alongside the Emperor and Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's most trusted advisor and closest thing to a friend, Valdor formed the ruling triumvirate that governed the newborn Imperium. If Malcador was the Emperor's right hand, the master of secrets and the architect of institutions, then Valdor was his left, thus the wielder of force and the guarantor of security. Between the three of them, they held the fate of humanity in their hands, but Valdor's position was unique among the three. The Emperor was, of course, beyond comparison, a being of such power and vision that to stand in his presence was to feel the weight of destiny pressing down upon you like a physical force. Malcador was brilliant and subtle, a master of the political arts who could weave alliances and conspiracies with equal skill. But Valdor was something different. He was the still point in the turning world, the immovable anchor around which the storm of imperial politics swirled without touching. He did not seek power for its own sake. He did not play the games of influence and prestige that consumed so many of those who orbited the Emperor's court. He simply existed at the center of things, watching everything with those ancient golden eyes, ready to act when action was required and content to wait when it was not. This quality of selfless, egoless service is perhaps the most remarkable thing about Valdor in an age dominated by personalities of mythic proportion. The Primarchs, when they were eventually found and returned to their father's side, were beings of tremendous charisma and ego. Even the most dutiful among them, warriors like Rogel Dawn and Robut Gilliman, carried within them the seeds of ambition and the desire to leave their mark upon the galaxy. They were designed that way, and crafted to be leaders and conquerors, to inspire millions and to shape the destiny of worlds. But Valdor wanted none of that. He wanted only to serve, and to serve well, and to be ready when the Emperor needed him. When Malcador revealed to Valdor that the Primarchs had survived their scattering by the Chaos Gods, and that the Emperor intended to find them, Valdor's reaction was telling. He was surprised, certainly. He had assumed the Primarchs were dead, but lost forever to whatever force had torn them from their creator. But more than surprise, what Valdor expressed was concern. He could not understand why the powers that had scattered the Primarchs across the galaxy would have spared their lives. If they were alive, Valdor reasoned, then they must be corrupted. They must have been tainted by whatever had touched them, and bringing them back into the fold was an invitation to disaster. Valdor proposed an alternative. Instead of searching for the Primarchs and building the Space Marine legions around them, he suggested raising armies of mortal soldiers to be led by his custodians. It was a proposal that was as practical as it was revealing. Valdor trusted his custodians completely because he understood what they were. They were the Emperor's creation, through and through, bound to his purpose by something deeper than loyalty, something woven into the very fabric of their enhanced biology. The Primarchs, by contrast, were unknowns. They had spent years, decades, growing up on alien worlds, shaped by alien cultures, developing personalities and attachments that the Emperor had never planned for. To Valdor, they were variables in an equation that demanded certainty. His concern would prove prophetic. Half the Primarchs would eventually turn traitor. leading their legions in a galaxy-spanning rebellion that would bring the Imperium to the brink of destruction. But in those early days, Valdor's warnings were overridden by the Emperor's own designs. The search for the Primarchs went forward, the legions were built around them, and Valdor accepted the decision with the same quiet stoicism that defined everything he did. He might have disagreed, but he would never disobey. Throughout the Great Crusade, as the Imperium expanded outward from Terra to reclaim the lost worlds of humanity, Valdor remained at the Emperor's side. He was not a crusader, and he did not lead fleets into the void or plant the Imperial banner on distant worlds. That was the work of the Primarchs and their legions, and Valdor had no desire to compete with them for glory or territory. His duty was singular and absolute: protect the Emperor. Wherever the Emperor went, Valdor went. Wherever the Emperor's safety was at stake, Valdor was there, the golden shadow that never left his master's side. This proximity to the Emperor gave Valdor a perspective that no one else in the Imperium could claim. He saw things that even the Primarchs were not privy to. He understood aspects of the Emperor's plan that were hidden from all but the most inner circle. He was present at councils where the fate of entire civilizations was decided in the space of a single conversation. And through it all, he watched. He listened. He measured. And he kept his counsel close, speaking only when his opinion was sought and offering it with the measured precision of a surgeon rather than the bluster of a demagogue. Prior to the Horus heresy, Valdor had earned 1,932 names. In the tradition of the Custodians, each name represented a deed of extraordinary valor or significance, added to the warrior's title as a mark of honor and accomplishment. These names were inscribed on the inside of the warrior's armor, and in some cases directly into their bones, as permanent records of a life dedicated to service. By the 41st Millennium, a book containing Valdor's full name reportedly filled an entire volume. That single detail tells you more about the scope of Valdor's service than any battle chronicle could. Over the course of centuries, this one warrior accomplished so many deeds worthy of remembrance that his name became a library unto itself, a living record of the Imperium's earliest and most desperate struggles. The burning of Prospero, when the betrayal of the War Master Horus finally shattered the illusion of imperial unity, Constantin Valdor found himself thrust into the heart of the catastrophe that would define the next 10,000 years of human history. But before the siege of Terra, before the traitor legions descended upon the throne world like a tide of corrupted fury, there was Prospero. And what happened on Prospero would change Valdor forever, yet in ways that perhaps he himself did not fully understand until much later. The story began with Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, a being of immense psychic power and insatiable intellectual curiosity. Magnus had foreseen the Horus heresy through his mastery of the warp, had seen the terrible future that was rushing toward them all, like a wave about to break. And in his desperation to warn his father, he did the one thing the Emperor had expressly forbidden. He used sorcery to penetrate the psychic wards protecting the Imperial Palace, tearing through the carefully crafted barriers that shielded the Emperor's secret webway project from the predations of the warp. The consequences were catastrophic. The breach in the palace's psychic defenses allowed floods of demons to pour into the human-built sections of the webway, slaughtering the thousands of Mechanicum workers who had been laboring there in secret, the Golden Throne. The device the Emperor had been using to maintain his psychic shield over the webway malfunctioned, and the Emperor himself was forced to take his seat upon the throne and pour his unfathomable psychic power into holding the breach closed, lest the demons pour through and consume Terra itself.
Honestly, this is one of the parts of the lore that just sits with me differently every time I come back to it. Valdor is not your typical 40k character. He doesn't have the tragic fall of Horus, he doesn't have the loud, dramatic arc of someone like Angron or Fulgrim. His story is almost uncomfortably quiet for a setting that thrives on war and noise, and I think that's what makes him so compelling. Here's the guy who stood next to the Emperor himself, was arguably the most dangerous individual in the entire Imperium outside of the Primarchs, and maybe even above some of them, and he just walked away. No grand speech, no last stand, no betrayal. He looked at everything he had built, everything he had bled for across thousands of years, and just decided it wasn't enough. Or maybe he decided he could do something better. And that's what gets me. We're so used to characters in this setting being defined by their loyalty or their corruption. Valdor doesn't fit neatly into either box. He's loyal but not blind. He saw the truth that the Apollyon Spear kept feeding him, all those stolen memories from demons and traitors, and instead of crumbling under it, he made a choice. Whether that choice was the right one, we still don't fully know. But the fact that he could make it at all, that a custodian, someone literally engineered to serve the Emperor without question, could look at 10,000 years of future suffering and say, no, there has to be another way, that's powerful stuff. But anyways, let's continue the video.
This single act, born of good intentions and catastrophic arrogance, effectively imprisoned the Emperor on the Golden Throne and left the waging of the Horus heresy to others. The Emperor was furious, and his fury demanded a response. A censure force was assembled, charged with traveling to Prospero, the Thousand Suns' homeworld, and bringing Magnus back to Terra to answer for his transgressions. At the head of this force was Constantin Valdor, bearing the Emperor's own authority in the form of the Magisterium Lex Ultima, the mark of office that made the custodians answerable to no one but the Emperor himself. Alongside Valdor's custodians came the Sisters of Silence under Knight Commander Janisha Kroll, those eerie, psychically null warriors whose very presence was anathema to the powers of the warp. Together, they were known as the Talons of the Emperor, and they were the most potent anti-psyker force in the galaxy. But the Emperor also sent Leman Russ, the Primarch of the Space Wolves, and this decision would prove to be one of the greatest tragedies of the heresy. A Russ despised sorcery with a primal, visceral hatred. He distrusted Magnus personally, and the two Primarchs had clashed repeatedly throughout the Great Crusade. The Emperor's orders were clear. Magnus was to be captured and returned to Terra alive. But Horus, already deep in his secret rebellion, intercepted the Emperor's communiqué and subtly altered it, changing the mission from one of capture to one of annihilation. Russ, already predisposed toward violence where Magnus was concerned, it needed little encouragement. Valdor saw what was happening. He understood that the mission was spiraling out of control, that Russ was being manipulated, that the Space Wolves' bloodlust was being deliberately inflamed by forces that wanted the Thousand Suns destroyed rather than redeemed. He tried to intervene. He tried to rein in the Wolf King, to remind him of the Emperor's true orders. But Valdor was not a Primarch. For all his power, for all the authority he carried, yet he could not simply command Leman Russ to stand down. And when the corruption of the Thousand Suns sorcerers was revealed in all its terrible reality, when the extent of their dealings with the warp became impossible to deny, even Valdor's hand was forced. The invasion of Prospero was a masterclass in combined arms warfare, and Valdor's contribution was devastating, while the Space Wolves hammered the Thousand Suns from the front. As Valdor and his custodians deployed alongside the Sisters of Silence in a precisely coordinated assault that exploited the unique abilities of both forces. The Sisters' psychic null field dampened the Thousand Suns' sorcerous powers, stripping away the supernatural abilities that were their greatest advantage, while the custodians brought their superhuman martial prowess to bear against enemies who suddenly found themselves fighting without their most potent weapons. As Valdor personally faced over 30 of the Thousand Suns' elite Kenetai Blademasters, warriors who possessed the psychic ability to predict their enemies' attacks before they landed. These were among the finest close combat fighters in the entire 15th Legion, each one a master swordsman enhanced by precognitive powers that should have made them virtually untouchable. Valdor killed every single one of them. He walked away from the engagement with a single wound. Well, there is a moment during the burning of Prospero that captures something essential about Valdor's character. The powerful Thousand Suns, Psyker Phosis Takar, one of the most formidable telekineses in the entire Legion, had unleashed his powers to their fullest extent in a desperate attempt to reach and kill Leman Russ. But in doing so, he had pushed himself beyond the limits of what flesh could endure. The warp energy flowing through him began to corrupt his physical form, triggering the dread flesh change that was the Thousand Sons' greatest curse. His body twisted and mutated, his features warping into something monstrous and no longer recognizable as human. Valdor stepped between the transformed Psyker and Russ, raised his weapon, and calmly declared his opponent a monster. And at that moment, something remarkable happened. Phosis Takar looked down at himself and realized what he had become. He saw the mutation, the corruption, the thing the warp had made of him. And in that moment of terrible clarity, he understood why the Emperor had forbidden the use of psychic powers at Nicaea. He lowered his guard. He accepted his fate. And he allowed Valdor to kill him, embracing death as the only clean thing left in a world that sorcery had fouled beyond redemption. It was a mercy killing, in its way. A moment of strange, shared understanding between two warriors on opposite sides of an impossible conflict. And Valdor did not gloat. He did not revel in the kill. He simply did what was necessary, as he always did, and moved on to the next engagement. The burning of Prospero ended in devastation. 9/10 of the Thousand Sons' legion was annihilated. The planet itself was reduced to a smoldering ruin. Magnus the Red, broken and betrayed, accepted the dark patronage of the chaos god Siench and led his surviving sons into the Eye of Terror. Transformed from loyal servants of the Emperor into sworn enemies of everything they had once fought to protect. It was exactly the outcome that Horus had engineered, and exactly the disaster that Valdor had tried to prevent. Valdor returned to Terra carrying the weight of that failure with him. He had done everything within his power to prevent the worst outcome, and it had not been enough. The Thousand Sons were lost. Another legion had been driven into the arms of chaos. And the man who should have prevented it, who should have held the line between duty and massacre, found himself looking back at the ashes of Prospero and wondering whether he could have done more. The war behind closed doors. When Valdor returned to Terra after the burning of Prospero, he found the throne world transformed. The Emperor's grand project, the webway that was supposed to liberate humanity from its dependence on the warp, lay in ruins. Magnus's psychic breach had opened a wound that could not be healed, and now the Emperor sat upon the golden throne in a state of constant psychic exertion, pouring his power into the device to keep the breach sealed and prevent the demons that swarmed within the webway from spilling out onto Terra itself. The webway project had been the Emperor's grandest ambition, a plan that dwarfed even the Great Crusade in its scope and significance. The concept was breathtaking in its audacity. The Emperor intended to capture and modify the ancient Elder Webway, a vast network of interdimensional pathways that allowed travel between any 2 points in the galaxy without entering the warp. If he could extend this network and open it to human use, the Imperium would no longer need warp drives, would no longer need navigators to steer ships through that hellish dimension, or would no longer be vulnerable to the predations of demons and the corrupting influence of the chaos gods during interstellar travel. Humanity would be free. To accomplish this, the Emperor had constructed the Golden Throne, a device of incredible complexity that sat at the junction between the material universe and the webway, serving as both a gateway and a psychic shield. Human workers had been extending the webway with new sections built from conventional materials, and the Emperor used his psychic power through the Golden Throne to protect these fragile human-built sections from the predatory entities of the warp. The entire project was conducted in absolute secrecy. Even the Primarchs had no idea what the Emperor was doing beneath the Imperial Palace, and this secrecy, this inability to explain his absence and his preoccupation, had been one of the factors that drove the wedge between father and sons that Chaos would eventually exploit. As Valdor had known about the Webway project, he was one of the very few who did, and he had been overseeing aspects of the project's security when Magnus's psychic message crashed through the wards like a wrecking ball through stained glass. The devastation was instantaneous and catastrophic. The psychic shields shattered. Demons poured through the breach like water through a broken dam. Thousands of Mechanicum workers were slaughtered in the opening moments of the assault, and the Emperor, A force to choose between the destruction of the webway and the destruction of terror, sat upon the golden throne and held the breach closed with the raw force of his will. The war within the webway was a conflict that the wider Imperium would never know about. It was fought in the labyrinthine passages beneath the Imperial Palace, in the human-built extensions of the ancient alien transit network that the Emperor had hoped to claim for humanity's use. On one side stood the Custodians and the Sisters of Silence, the Emperor's most elite warriors, fighting with the desperation born of the knowledge that failure would mean the literal end of everything. On the other side came an endless tide of demonic entities, reinforced over time by corrupted space marines, chaos titans, and greater demons of terrifying power. The fighting was apocalyptic. The Custodians established blockades across the webway tunnels, holding the line while Mechanicum workers labored behind them to repair the damage and seal the rifts that allowed the demons to pour through. In front of these positions, the Golden Warriors and the Silent Sisters launched lightning-fast counterattacks, striking at the demonic hordes before they could mass in sufficient numbers to overwhelm the defenses. It was a pattern of constant, grinding attrition, a war of inches fought in the claustrophobic confines of corridors designed by an alien intelligence millions of years old. The cost was staggering. The Custodians, those irreplaceable masterworks of genetic engineering, were ground down by the relentless assault. Losses that would have been unthinkable in any other context became routine. Warriors who had served the Emperor since the earliest days of the Unification Wars fell to demonic blades and warp-spawned hellfire, their golden armor corroded by the touch of unreality, their bodies torn apart by creatures that should not have been able to exist in the material universe. By the time the war within the webway finally ended, the Custodian Guard had been reduced by 90%. 9 out of every 10 of the Emperor's Golden Warriors were dead, their sacrifice buying time for a plan that had already failed. While the majority of his Custodians fought and died in the webway, Valdor himself remained above, or assuming a crucial position on the Loyalist War Council alongside Malcador, Rogel Dawn, and other senior Imperial commanders. The Emperor's imprisonment on the Golden Throne meant that the defense of the Imperium against the Horus heresy had to be managed by those he left behind, and Valdor became one of the key strategic minds guiding that defense. It was during this period that one of the most fascinating conflicts in the heresy played out, not on any battlefield, but in the council chambers of the Imperial Palace. Valdor and Rogel Dawn, the Primarch of the Imperial Fists and the architect of Terra's defenses, found themselves locked in a philosophical disagreement that would never truly be resolved. The argument centered on the attempted assassination of Horus. Valdor had overseen the deployment of the first ever execution team, a joint operation drawing operatives from every clade of the Officio Assassinorum, Venenum, Eversor, Calexis, Vanus, Calidus, and Vindicae, each one contributing their most skilled assassin to a single, unprecedented mission: kill the Warmaster. The operation was sanctioned by Malcador himself, who in his secret role as Master of Assassins had the authority to call such a mission into being. Dawn was appalled. The Primarch of the Imperial Fists believed that to resort to assassination was to abandon the moral code that gave the Imperium its right to exist. He argued that Horus, as a known enemy, was actually less dangerous than an unknown replacement might be. Kill the head, and the body would not simply die. It would find a new head, perhaps one more cunning, more unpredictable, more dangerous. Valdor saw it differently. To him, the distinction between honorable warfare and expedient killing was a luxury that the Imperium could not afford. Every day that Horus lived was a day that the traitor forces grew stronger. And every battle fought against the Warmaster's legions was a battle that cost the Emperor loyal warriors who could never be replaced. If a single blade in the dark could end the war, then the morality of that blade was irrelevant. What mattered was the outcome. The argument was never truly settled. The assassination attempt failed, as Horus had been tipped off and sent a proxy in his place. The Emperor, when he was able to communicate his wishes, Orm put an end to the debate with a simple decree that echoed through the chambers of the palace like the tolling of a bell. No more shadows, no more veils. The implication was clear. The emperor had weighed the arguments of both his son and his guardian, and he had chosen to face Horus directly in the light, without subterfuge or deception. Whether Valdor agreed with this decision or merely accepted it, as he accepted all of the emperor's decisions, we cannot know. But there is something poignant in the image of the empire's most pragmatic warrior being told that pragmatism was no longer sufficient, that the final battle would be fought not with the assassin's blade, but with the warrior's sword. Valdor, who had spent his entire existence in the shadows between duty and morality, was being told to step into the light. And the light, as he would soon discover, was a place of terrible clarity. The Siege of Terror and the Spear that Reveals Truth. The Siege of Terror was the apocalypse. There is no other word that adequately captures the scale of what happened when the traitor legions finally descended upon the throne world of humanity. For 9 years, the forces of Horus had been building toward this moment, gathering strength, rallying allies, corrupting everything they touched with the poison of the warp. And now, at last, the hammer fell, the skies burned, and megatons of explosive ordnance rained down upon the imperial palace, reducing 1,000-year-old fortifications to rubble in the space of heartbeats. Demonic entities spilled through tears in reality itself, manifesting in the middle of the defenders' lines, and bringing with them a wrongness that could be felt in the bones, a violation of natural law so profound that merely witnessing it was enough to drive men mad. Chaos Titans hammered the palace walls with weapons designed to level cities. And through it all, the traitor legions came, wave after wave of corrupted space marines who had once been humanity's finest defenders, now twisted into instruments of destruction that fought with a fury born of damnation. Valdor led his surviving custodians in defense of the palace with a ferocity that even the traitors had not anticipated. The custodians, forged by the emperor's own hand, proved to be particularly lethal against the forces of chaos. Their emperor-crafted nature made them naturally resistant to corruption, and the touch of their weapons seemed to carry a fraction of the emperor's own power, burning away the warp taint that sustained the traitors' newfound abilities. The Death Guard, those bloated, pestilent servants of the plague god Nurgle, found themselves losing dozens, even hundreds of their number, to Custodian counterattacks that struck with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel and the force of a falling mountain. Valdor was everywhere during the siege, or so it seemed to those who fought beside him. He led counterattacks that threw back traitor assaults at critical points. He rallied defenders who had been pushed to the very edge of despair, his golden presence cutting through the fog of terror and hopelessness that the forces of chaos projected like a weapon in its own right. He killed traitor marines by the score, on his legendary Apollonian spear singing through the air with a voice that was part weapon and part judgment, each kill adding another name to the chronicle of his deeds. The Apollonian spear. It deserves special attention because it is central to understanding what happened to Valdor during the siege and what came after. This weapon was not merely a supremely crafted instrument of war, though it was certainly that, forged by the emperor himself during the Age of Strife. And inside his very first subterranean fortress, the Apollonian spear was one of 2 paired weapons that contained a portion of the emperor's own power. Its sister weapon, the Dionysian spear, which was eventually given to Leman Russ, had the ability to reveal truths to those it struck. The Apollonian spear worked differently. It revealed truths to the wielder from those it killed. Every enemy that fell to the Apollonian spear imparted some fragment of their knowledge, their experience, their understanding to the one who held it. For most of Valdor's career, this had been a useful but manageable effect. Killing human enemies, killing alien threats, even killing the occasional psychic warrior. All of these provided information that could be processed, categorized, and filed away in the orderly vaults of Valdor's engineered mind. But during the Siege of Terror, Valdor was killing demons. Thousands of them, tens of thousands, and with each kill, the Apollonian spear poured the knowledge of those demonic entities into his consciousness, the truths of the warp, the secrets of the chaos gods, the nature of unreality itself. Imagine having the screaming madness of 100,000 demons forced into your mind, each one carrying a fragment of a truth that mortals were never meant to comprehend. Imagine absorbing the knowledge of beings that existed outside of time, that had witnessed the birth and death of stars, that understood the fundamental architecture of reality in ways that contradicted everything you had ever been taught to believe. This is what happened to Constantin Valdor during the Siege of Terror. The Apollonian spear, which the emperor had given him as a check against callousness, as a way to ensure that Valdor never became too comfortable with killing, turned into a conduit for revelations that shook the foundations of everything he had ever known. The gene-bred, absolute trust in the emperor that had been the bedrock of Valdor's existence for centuries began to erode, not through corruption or weakness, but through the simple, terrible mechanism of understanding too much. In the final desperate hours of the siege, when Horus dropped the void shields of his flagship, the vengeful spirit, to bait the emperor into a final confrontation, Valdor was among those chosen to accompany his master in the teleportation assault. The elite strike force, consisting of the emperor, several primarchs including Sanguinius and Rogel Dawn, space marines and custodians, hurled themselves through the warp and into the belly of the corrupted warship for the battle that would decide the fate of the galaxy. But the teleportation went wrong, as the forces of chaos had intended. The strike force was scattered throughout the vast, warp-corrupted interior of the vengeful spirit, and separated from each other and forced to fight their way through nightmarish corridors that seemed to shift and change with malevolent intent. Valdor and his custodians found themselves trapped in a dark abyss surrounded by demons, part of a trap specifically designed by Horus to torment the Captain General and prevent him from reaching the Emperor's side. It was here, in the warp-twisted depths of the vengeful spirit, that Valdor experienced something he had never felt before in his centuries of existence. Fear. Not the physical fear of a mortal facing death, but the existential terror of a being who realized that he could not fulfill the one duty that gave his existence meaning. He could not reach the Emperor. He could not protect his master. He was trapped, surrounded, fighting for his life against an enemy that existed to specifically deny him his purpose. But even fear could not stop Constantin Valdor, when he plunged the Apollonian spear into the floor of the vengeful spirit itself, using the weapon's truth-revealing properties against the ship's warp-mutated structure to confirm his location and find a path toward the Emperor. And then he fought. He fought through hordes of demons with a fury that bordered on the supernatural. He cut through the darkness like a blade of living gold, each step carrying him closer to the confrontation that was shaking the foundations of reality. During this desperate fight, Valdor engaged Abaddon, the first captain of the Sons of Horus, who would one day become the most feared Chaos champion in the galaxy. Pinned down by 6 Justaran Terminators and badly wounded by a warrior named Hellas Siccar, Valdor kept fighting. He managed to cut Abaddon with the Apollonian spear, and in that moment of contact, the weapon poured into Valdor's mind a vision of the next 10,000 years, a panorama of endless, grinding, a purposeless war that stretched from the ashes of the heresy to a future so bleak and so blood-soaked that it defied comprehension. Valdor looked at Abaddon and named him what he would become, Despoiler, and then he punched him. The experience left Valdor shaken in a way that nothing else in his long life had managed. He had seen the future. He had seen what the Imperium would become in the wake of the Emperor's fall, and the knowledge of that future, as combined with the accumulated truths absorbed from thousands of slain demons, planted seeds of doubt and disillusionment that would eventually drive the most loyal warrior in the Imperium to abandon everything he had ever known. In the end, the Emperor defeated Horus. But the cost was beyond calculation. Sanguinius, the beautiful, beloved angel, lay dead at his brother's feet. The Emperor himself was mortally wounded, his body shattered beyond the ability of any technology to repair. Yet he was carried back to Terra by his grief-stricken custodians and interred upon the Golden Throne, where he would remain for the next 10,000 years. A corpse sustained by ancient machinery and the daily sacrifice of 1,000 human psykers, the undying anchor of a civilization that had already begun to rot from within. The custodians swore a penitent's oath and donned the mourning black, consigning themselves to an eternal vigil over their fallen lord. They had failed. Despite everything they had done, despite every sacrifice they had made, they had not been able to prevent the unthinkable. The Emperor was lost to them, trapped between life and death on a throne of gold and suffering. And Constantin Valdor, the first of the 10,000, the shield of the Emperor, the warrior who had never once faltered in his duty, stood before that throne and confronted the terrible truth of his own inadequacy. Yet the great disappearance. What happened next is the heart of the mystery. It is the question that has haunted Imperial scholars, Custodian historians, and lore enthusiasts for 10,000 years. What happened to Constantin Valdor? In the aftermath of the heresy, during the period known as the Great Scouring, when the Emperor's surviving loyal sons led their legions in a furious campaign of vengeance against the retreating traitor forces, the Custodians took no part. They stood their somber watch upon the throne world, contemplating their failure, their golden armor turned to mourning black. The galaxy burned with the fires of retribution, but the 10,000 remained at their post, silent and grieving, their eyes fixed upon the ruined body of the master they had failed to save. Valdor agreed with the decisions that followed. When Robert Guillemot, the pragmatic lord of the Ultramarines, enacted the Edict of Restraint, as the law that limited the Custodians to the defense of the Imperial Palace and forbade them from engaging in the wider conflicts of the galaxy, Valdor concurred. It was, perhaps, a form of self-imposed penance, a recognition that the Custodians had been so focused on the war they were fighting that they had failed to prevent the war they were meant to stop. And then Valdor resigned. He stepped down from the position of Captain General, as a title he had held since before the dawn of the Great Crusade. He surrendered his authority to a successor elected from among the Custodians' own ranks. And then, taking his weapons and his armor with him, artifacts that by rights should have been placed in the Hall of Armaments as sacred relics of a fallen age, he walked out of the Imperial Palace and vanished from the pages of history. No record exists of where he went. No witness has ever come forward to describe seeing him leave. And no surveillance system, no security checkpoint, no watchful eye recorded his departure. One day he was there, the most recognizable warrior in the Imperium, a figure of such stature and presence that his absence was felt like a physical wound in the palace he had called home for centuries. And the next day he was gone, as completely and as thoroughly as if he had never existed at all. The Custodians elected a new Captain General and continued their vigil. They did not speak of Valdor's departure, at least not publicly. His name was not stricken from the records, but neither was it celebrated. He became a silence in the Imperial Chronicle, an absence shaped like a question mark, a ghost haunting the golden corridors of the palace he had helped to build. But why? Why did the most loyal warrior in the Imperium abandon his post? Why did the being who had been crafted from infancy to serve the Emperor, who had been engineered down to the molecular level for a single, absolute purpose, suddenly decide that his purpose was done? The official record offers no answers, but if we look carefully at the evidence, if we consider what Valdor had experienced during the Siege of Terra, we can begin to construct a theory. The Apollonian spear had shown him truths that no mortal, no enhanced warrior, no genetically engineered demigod was ever meant to know. The accumulated knowledge of thousands of slain daemons had poured into his mind, filling it with the secrets of the warp and the terrible realities that lurked behind the comforting lies of imperial theology. He had seen the future through his cut on Abaddon, a panorama of 10,000 years of meaningless bloodshed and spiritual decay. and he had watched the Emperor, the being he had served since childhood, the center of his entire existence, reduced to a corpse on a golden throne, as sustained by suffering and worshipped as a god by the very people his philosophy had been designed to save from the tyranny of gods. Imagine what that must have been like for Valdor. Imagine spending centuries as the ultimate loyalist, the perfect servant, the warrior who never questioned and never wavered, only to have the foundations of your belief systematically dismantled by knowledge you could not ignore and truths you could not unsee. Imagine looking at the Imperium you had helped to build and seeing, with terrible clarity, that it had already become the very thing it was created to prevent. A theocracy built on superstition and fear, ruled by priests and bureaucrats who worshipped a dead god and persecuted anyone who dared to question the dogma. Perhaps Valdor looked at all of this and decided that his duty, his true duty, lay not in standing guard over a corpse, but in doing something about the catastrophe unfolding around him. Perhaps the truths he had absorbed gave him a vision of an alternative, a different path, a way to salvage something from the wreckage of the Emperor's dream. Or perhaps he simply broke. Perhaps even the most perfectly engineered warrior in history has a breaking point, a moment when the weight of knowledge and grief and disillusionment becomes too much to bear. We do not know. But what we do know, thanks to the work of certain very dedicated and very brave investigators working in the shadowy margins of the 41st Millennium, is that Valdor's story did not end with his disappearance. It continued, in the darkness, in the silence, for 10,000 years. The King in Yellow. Now we enter the realm of the uncertain, the speculative, the dangerously fascinating. Because the evidence suggests that Constantin Valdor did not simply vanish into obscurity. It suggests that he reinvented himself, that he assumed a new identity, that he spent the next 10 millennia building something in the shadows, something so vast and so dangerous that its mere existence has drawn the attention of the Inquisition, the Eldar, and possibly even the Chaos Gods themselves. The evidence comes primarily from the work of Dan Abnett, one of the most brilliant and trusted authors in the Warhammer 40,000 setting, through his Eisenhorn, Ravenor, and Bequin series of novels. In these books, which are set in approximately the 500th year of the 41st Millennium, the Inquisition is hunting a mysterious and immensely powerful figure known only as the King in Yellow. The King in Yellow is understood to have spent millennia marshalling powerful forces of his own, operating from a hidden domain that exists outside of both the material universe and the conventional warp. This domain, as referred to as an extimate space, is a place that defies easy classification, a pocket of reality that obeys its own rules and is shielded from the prying eyes of both imperial and chaotic surveillance. From this hidden fastness, the King has been building something, an army, a plan, a project of such scope and ambition that its completion could shake the Imperium to its very foundations. The Inquisition first became aware of the King in Yellow through the activities of the Cognitae, a shadowy organization that has been described as a counter-Inquisition, a mirror image of the Emperor's own secret police that operates according to its own agenda and answers to its own master. The Cognitae has been involved in all manner of heretical activities across the galaxy, from the recruitment and training of psychic null operatives to the development of strange and powerful warp-based entities called Grails, floating orbs of energy whose true purpose remains unclear. But the most shocking revelation comes at the end of the novel Penitent, the second book in the Bequin trilogy. Through a series of brilliant and terrifying deductions, the protagonist, Elizabeth Bequin, working alongside legendary Inquisitors Eisenhorn and Ravenor, discovers the true identity of the King in Yellow. A book is recovered, translated, decoded, and on its final page, a name is revealed. The beginning of a name, technically, since the full name reportedly fills an entire volume, was millions of characters long, each one representing a deed of extraordinary significance performed over the course of more than 11,000 years of existence. That name begins with Constantin Valdor. The implications of this revelation are extraordinary. If the King in Yellow is indeed Valdor, then we are looking at an 11,000-year-old custodian warrior who has been operating independently of the Imperium for the majority of that time. A being who has apparently cooperated with heretical cults, possibly even with Chaos Space Marine legions, in pursuit of a goal that remains frustratingly unclear. A warrior who was once the most loyal servant of the Emperor, now apparently working against the very Imperium he helped to create. But is it really that simple? Is Valdor truly working against the Imperium? Or is he working against what the Imperium has become, which is a very different thing? Remember, Valdor served the Emperor, and not the Imperium. His loyalty was to a man and a vision, not to an institution, and the institution that the Imperium has become in the 41st millennium, a bloated, corrupt, superstitious theocracy that would have been unrecognizable to the Emperor who created it, might well be something that Valdor views as an abomination rather than a continuation of his master's legacy. The evidence from Abnett's novels paints a picture of the King in Yellow as a being with an incredibly complex and multi-layered agenda. He appears to be amassing an army of psychically inert humans, individuals known as blanks or pariahs, whose null nature makes them invisible to the warp and immune to psychic manipulation. He is developing or cultivating the Grails, those mysterious warp entities that seem to serve as weapons or tools of some kind. There are hints of genetically altered, winged space marines that echo the legacy of the fallen Primarch Sanguinius. There are suggestions of work with Enuncia, the primordial language of creation and destruction that the Emperor himself studied in his earliest days. Some theories suggest that Valdor may be seeking a way to resurrect the Emperor, to free him from the Golden Throne and restore him to a new body. Others propose that he is attempting to complete the Webway project that Magnus's folly destroyed, or to create a new method by which humanity can free itself from its dependence on the warp. Still others believe he may be trying to destroy the Chaos Gods themselves, using the knowledge absorbed through the Apollonian spear to find a weakness in the architecture of the Immaterium that mortal minds were never meant to perceive. The Eldar apparently take the King in Yellow very seriously indeed. 5 entire craft worlds, vast interstellar vessels carrying millions of Eldar survivors, dispatched forces to the sector where the King's activities are concentrated. 5 craft worlds committing resources to a single operation is an event of almost unprecedented significance in Eldar culture, suggesting that whatever the King is doing, the Eldar view it as an existential threat, or perhaps an opportunity, of the highest magnitude. There is a theory, a compelling one, that suggests the King in Yellow is not actually the original Constantin Valdor at all, but rather a clone. The Bequin novels are saturated with themes of duplicated identity, of clones and copies and reflections that are not quite what they appear to be. The protagonist herself is a genetic derivative of the original Elizabeth Bequin from the Eisenhorn novels, a copy that has developed her own identity and her own agency, but remains haunted by the shadow of her progenitor. In a story so deeply concerned with the question of what identity means, perhaps it would be entirely in keeping with the themes for the King in Yellow to be a copy of Valdor rather than the original, a being who carries Valdor's name and perhaps his memories, but whose motivations and loyalties might be different in subtle and potentially devastating ways. But whether original or copy, the King in Yellow represents the most tantalizing open question in current Warhammer 40,000 lore. He is a ticking time bomb buried in the heart of the setting, and a plot thread that connects the earliest days of the Imperium to its possible future, a mystery that has the potential to reshape everything we think we know about the galaxy and the forces that drive it. The Apollonian spear and the weight of truth. To truly understand what might have driven Valdor from his post, we need to look more closely at the weapon that was both his greatest tool and, perhaps, his greatest burden. The Apollonian spear was not merely a weapon of physical destruction, whilst it was a conduit for knowledge, a device that forced its wielder to confront the truth of every life it ended. And over the course of centuries, the accumulated weight of those truths shaped Valdor's understanding of the universe in ways that the Emperor may not have fully anticipated. The Emperor crafted the Apollonian spear and its sister weapon, the Dionysian spear during the Age of Strife, in the very first subterranean fortress he ever built. Both weapons contained a portion of his own power, making them among the most potent artifacts in the entire Imperium. The Dionysian spear, which was eventually given to Leman Russ, revealed truths to those it struck, illuminating the minds of its victims with some aspect of reality that they had been too blind or too afraid to see. Russ, notably, was deeply uncomfortable with the weapon. He would frequently lose it on battlefields or forget it in conference chambers, and only to have it mysteriously return to his side. There was something about the Dionysian spear that the Wolf King found fundamentally unsettling, a sense that the truths it carried were not always welcome ones. The Apollonian spear worked in reverse. Instead of revealing truths to its victims, it revealed truths to the wielder. Every enemy slain with the spear imparted some fragment of their knowledge, their experience, their understanding of the world. For Valdor, this meant that every kill was also an education, a forced download of information that could not be refused or filtered. When he killed human enemies during the Unification Wars, the truths he absorbed were manageable. The perspectives of warlords and tyrants, the strategies of generals, the fears of ordinary soldiers. These were human truths, grounded in the material world, comprehensible to a mind that had been engineered to process and categorize vast quantities of information. But during the Siege of Terror, everything changed. Valdor was no longer killing humans. He was killing demons, entities born from the stuff of the warp itself, beings whose existence was predicated on truths that contradicted the fundamental assumptions of rational reality. Every demon he destroyed with the Apollonian spear poured a fragment of the warp's knowledge into his mind, like a river of madness pouring into a vessel designed to hold still water. The truths of the Chaos Gods, the nature of the Imperium, the fundamental architecture of a universe that was far stranger, far more terrible, and far more complex than even the Emperor had let on. We can only imagine the effect this must have had on Valdor's mind. He was, remember, a being engineered for certainty. His entire existence was built around clear purpose, absolute loyalty, and unwavering duty. The Custodians were not like the Space Marines, who retained some measure of emotional complexity and individual personality. The Custodians were more refined, more focused, more completely dedicated to their single, overriding purpose. They were the Emperor's instruments, tuned to a perfect pitch of service and sacrifice. And then, the Apollonian spear started playing a different song. A song made of demon-whispered truths and warp-born revelations, of knowledge that no mortal mind was ever meant to hold. It did not corrupt Valdor, and not in the way that chaos corrupts its victims. There was no temptation, no seduction, no gradual erosion of moral principle. What happened was something more subtle and, in many ways, more devastating. Valdor simply learned too much. He came to understand things about the universe that made his previous understanding seem naive, things that cast the Emperor's great plan in a light that was far less flattering than the golden glow of Imperial propaganda. And when he cut Abaddon with the spear during the desperate fighting aboard the Vengeful Spirit, the weapon showed him the future. Not a single moment, not a flash of insight, but 10,000 years of war. The Long War, they would call it. An eternity of bloodshed and suffering and decay, of an Imperium that survived only by becoming everything it was created to prevent, of a god enthroned on gold and pain, while his worshippers killed each other in his name. Valdor saw all of it. He saw the Imperium of the 41st millennium before it existed, saw the bloated corpse of the dream he had served since childhood, and he named the man who would personify that nightmare of endless war. Despoiler. After that experience, Valdor was changed. Those who fought beside him during the final hours of the siege noticed the difference. He was more brutal, more impatient, quicker to anger. He cursed at dawn and the Astartes with a venom that was entirely unlike the calm, unmeasured Captain General they had known. The truths of the spear had burned something out of him, or perhaps burned something into him, a knowledge that made the old certainties seem hollow and the old loyalties feel like chains. When the fighting was over and the Emperor had been placed upon the golden throne, Valdor stood at the crossroads of his existence. He could remain as he was, the loyal servant standing guard over a ruined dream, watching the slow descent of everything he had helped to build. Or he could leave, taking with him the terrible knowledge that the spear had given him, and try to do something about what he had seen, to find a different path, to pursue a different kind of loyalty, not to the Imperium as it was, but to the vision of what it could have been. He chose to leave, and in doing so, he took not just his armor and his weapons, but something far more valuable. Yet he took 10,000 years of accumulated truth, the combined knowledge of every enemy he had ever slain, including thousands of demonic entities whose understanding of reality far exceeded anything available to mortal science. He took the insights of the Apollonian spear, the revelations that had shaken his faith and shattered his certainties, and he took himself, as a being of superhuman capability, whose understanding of the universe had been expanded beyond anything the Emperor had ever intended. Whatever Valdor has been doing for the last 10,000 years, he has been doing it with resources and knowledge that make him one of the most dangerous individuals in the galaxy, not because of his physical power, though that remains formidable, but because of what he knows, because of what the spear taught him, but because of the truths that burned their way into his consciousness through 10,000 demonic deaths and one glimpse of an apocalyptic future. The custodians he left behind. The departure of Constantin Valdor left a void in the Adeptus Custodes that has never truly been filled. Oh, other captain generals have served with distinction. The current holder of the title, Trajan Valoris, he is, by all accounts, a formidable warrior and a capable leader who has led the custodians back into active service beyond the walls of the imperial palace for the first time in millennia. But Valdor was something more than a commander. He was the foundation stone upon which the entire edifice of the Custodian Guard was built, the living embodiment of everything they were supposed to be. His departure was not just the loss of a leader, it was the loss of an ideal. After the heresy, the custodians entered a long period of withdrawal and introspection. Bound by the Edict of Restraint, they confined themselves to the imperial palace, watching over the emperor's body and standing guard against threats that, for the most part, never materialized. They maintained their martial skills through constant training, sometimes capturing dangerous enemies such as Chaos Space Marines or even Tyrannid bioforms, and releasing them within sealed sections of the palace for custodians to hunt down and destroy. But for 10,000 years, they fought no real wars, won no real victories, served no real purpose beyond the preservation of a status quo that grew more desperate with each passing century. This is the context in which Valdor's departure must be understood. He did not simply leave a military organization. He left a family. The custodians were, in many ways, the Emperor's true children, crafted from his own genetic template with more care and more love, if such a word can be applied to the Emperor, than even the Primarchs had received. They were brothers in a bond deeper than blood, united by a shared creation process and a shared purpose that transcended individual identity. When Valdor left, he left that brotherhood behind, and the brotherhood felt his absence. In the deep halls of the palace, where dormant custodian equipment hummed in the darkness, and the weight of 10,000 years pressed down upon the spirits of those who stood watch, the name of Valdor was spoken with a reverence that bordered on worship. He was the first, the template, the standard against which all others were measured and found wanting, not because they lacked courage or skill, but because they lacked whatever quality had made Valdor unique among a force of unique individuals. His weapons and armor, as the Apollonian spear and the Corinthian warplate, were not placed in the Hall of Armaments because Valdor took them with him when he departed. This was a breach of tradition so severe that it bordered on sacrilege. Those artifacts were the property of the Custodian Guard, sacred relics imbued with the Emperor's own power, objects of such historical and spiritual significance that their loss was mourned almost as deeply as Valdor's departure itself. the Apollonian spear in particular. It was irreplaceable. Forged by the Emperor during the Age of Strife, carried by his hand during the Unification Wars, wielded by Valdor throughout the Great Crusade and the Heresy, it was one of the most powerful and symbolically important weapons in the entire Imperium, and Valdor simply walked away with it. One later source suggests the Apollonian spear was eventually recovered and placed in storage by the Custodes, treated as a relic that is only brought out in the most dire circumstances. But the circumstances of its return to the Custodians, if indeed it did return, are never clearly explained. Did Valdor send it back? Did someone find it? Did the weapon itself somehow return, as its sister weapon, the Dionysian spear, was known to do, drawn back to its resting place by some quality of the Emperor's power that transcended mere physical possession? The answers, like so much about Valdor, remain shrouded in mystery, and the Custodians, true to their nature, do not discuss the matter publicly. They guard their secrets as jealously as they guard the Emperor's body, and the secret of Constantin Valdor, wherever he went and whatever he is doing, is perhaps the most closely guarded secret of all. There is also the matter of the Edict of Restraint, and what it reveals about Valdor's state of mind in those final days. The law that confined the Custodians to the Imperial Palace was not imposed upon them by outsiders. It was enacted by Guilliman, Dorn, and Valdor himself, a collaborative decision by three of the most powerful figures in the post-heresy Imperium. Valdor agreed to confine his own warriors to the palace, to take them out of the galaxy-spanning conflicts that raged in the aftermath of the heresy, to reduce the most powerful military force in the Imperium to a glorified honor guard. Why would he do that? Why would the commander of the 10,000, a warrior who understood better than anyone the threats facing the Imperium, who voluntarily remove his forces from active service? One possibility is penance. The Custodians had failed in their primary mission, the protection of the Emperor. Perhaps Valdor believed that his warriors needed time to reflect on that failure, to reckon with the enormity of what had happened, before they could be trusted to serve again. Another possibility is pragmatism. The Custodians had been reduced to a fraction of their former strength by the war within the webway, or sending what remained of them into the chaos of the Great Scouring would risk the complete destruction of a force that was already dangerously depleted. But there is a third possibility, one that is far more troubling. Perhaps Valdor agreed to the Edict of Restraint because he already knew he was going to leave. Perhaps he was already planning his departure, already laying the groundwork for whatever came next. And the edict served his purposes by ensuring that the Custodians would not come looking for him. If they were confined to the palace, if they were forbidden from venturing beyond Terra, then Valdor could disappear into the galaxy knowing that no golden armored search party would follow. It is a calculated, cold-blooded interpretation, and it may be too cynical by half. But given what we know about Valdor's strategic mind and his capacity for long-term planning, it cannot be dismissed entirely. Valdor and the Primarchs, a study in contrast. One of the most illuminating ways to understand Valdor is to compare him with the Primarchs, those 20 demigods who were created after him and who dominated the narrative of the Great Crusade and the heresy in ways that Valdor never did. The Primarchs were designed to be everything that Valdor was not. Where Valdor was self-effacing, the Primarchs were charismatic. Where Valdor sought anonymity, the Primarchs demanded attention. But where Valdor measured his worth by the quality of his service, the Primarchs measured theirs by the scope of their achievements. This created an inherent tension between Valdor and the Primarchs that simmered beneath the surface throughout the Great Crusade. Valdor was, in a very real sense, the Emperor's first son, the original product of the Emperor's genetic artistry. He had been at the Emperor's side since before the Primarchs were even conceived, let alone created. And he had helped to build the Imperium that the Primarchs were raised to expand. And yet, when the Primarchs arrived, they immediately eclipsed him in terms of status, authority, and public recognition. The Primarchs received their own legions, armies of thousands of space marines, who worshipped them with a fervor that bordered on religious devotion. They were given entire sectors of the galaxy to conquer and govern. They sat at the right hand of the Emperor in councils of war and debated the fate of civilizations with the casualness of men discussing the weather. Valdor, by contrast, remained in the shadows, the silent guardian who watched and waited and intervened only when absolutely necessary. There is a fascinating moment recorded in the lore that captures this dynamic perfectly. Valdor once dueled Alfarius, the Primarch of the Alpha Legion, to a stalemate, apparently without realizing who he was fighting. This alone is a remarkable testament to Valdor's martial prowess, as even fighting to a draw with a Primarch puts him in a class of warriors that can be counted on one hand. But what is most revealing is what happened afterward. Alfarius was reportedly confident that he could have killed Valdor had he wished to, and Valdor was reportedly uncharacteristically irritated by this assessment. It is one of the few moments in the historical record where Valdor shows something resembling ego, something resembling the competitive drive that defines so many of the Primarchs. And it suggests that, beneath the golden armor and the perfect self-control, Valdor was not entirely immune to the very human desire to be acknowledged as what he was, a warrior without equal. This tension with the Primarchs may have played a role in Valdor's skepticism about their creation. When Malcador told him that the Primarchs had survived their scattering and that the Emperor intended to find them, Valdor's first instinct was suspicion, not joy. He could not understand why the forces of chaos would have spared them. He believed they must be corrupted, and he proposed an alternative, raising mortal armies led by Custodians instead of Primarch-led legions. This proposal reveals something profound about Valdor's worldview, and he trusted the Custodians because they were known quantities, beings whose loyalty had been engineered and tested over decades of service. The Primarchs were unknown, unpredictable, shaped by alien cultures and alien experiences that the Emperor could not control. To Valdor, the risk of bringing them into the fold was simply too great. The rewards, however magnificent, could not justify the potential for catastrophe. History proved him right. Half the Primarchs fell to chaos, leading their legions in a rebellion that killed billions and left the Imperium a broken shadow of what it had been. The Primarch project, for all its brilliance, was also the Emperor's greatest failure. And Valdor, who had warned against it from the beginning, was left to deal with the consequences of a decision he had opposed, but never had the authority to prevent. One wonders what might have been different if the Emperor had listened. If instead of 20 Primarchs leading 20 legions, or the Great Crusade had been carried out by mortal armies led by Custodian commanders, as Valdor had suggested, there would have been no Horus heresy. No Primarch could have fallen because no Primarchs would have existed. The Crusade might have taken longer, might have been less spectacular, might have lacked the mythic grandeur that the Primarchs brought to the narrative of human expansion, but the Imperium might have survived intact, as the Emperor might still sit upon his throne as a living ruler rather than a dying god, and Constantin Valdor might never have had reason to walk away. But history does not deal in might-have-beens, it deals in what happened. And what happened was the Horus heresy, the greatest catastrophe in human history, and the chain of events that led to Valdor's disappearance, and the 10,000-year mystery that followed. The King in Yellow. Before we come to the end of our journey, it is worth pausing to consider who Constantin Valdor was as a person, as much as that term can be applied to a being so far removed from ordinary humanity. Because the mystery of Valdor is not just a mystery of events and locations and plot threads, it is fundamentally a mystery of character. Who was this man really? What drove him? What did he feel, if he felt anything at all? And what does his story tell us about the nature of duty, loyalty, or on the terrible price that perfect service demands? Valdor was, by all accounts, a being of extraordinary self-control and emotional restraint. He did not swagger or boast. He did not seek attention or accolades. He was stoic and watchful, content to stand in the background while others took center stage, speaking only when his opinion was sought and offering it with a precision that left no room for ambiguity or misunderstanding. His fellow custodians respected him absolutely. But the Primarchs regarded him with a mixture of admiration and unease, recognizing in him a reflection of the Emperor's will that was, in some ways, more pure and more focused than their own. But beneath that golden exterior, there were hints of something more complex. During the palace coup, when he had every reason and every right to kill Kandawire alongside the rebels she had led against him, Valdor chose mercy. He let her walk away, sparing her life when pragmatism demanded her death. This was not the act of a machine. It was the act of a being who retained some capacity for grace, some understanding that duty did not always mean destruction, and that the strongest weapon was sometimes the one left undrawn. During the Unification Wars, when he slew the Thunder Warrior General Ushatan in single combat, it was noted that Valdor took no pleasure in the act. He had respected Ushatan, admired his skill and his courage, and the necessity of killing him weighed upon Valdor in a way that suggested the Captain General was not as emotionally detached as he appeared. He did what he had to do, as he always did, but the doing of it cost him something that could not be measured in strategic terms. And there is the question of his relationship with the Emperor. Valdor was closer to the Emperor than perhaps any other living being. He had been at his side since before the Primarchs existed, since before the Great Crusade began, since the earliest days of the Unification Wars, when the dream of a united humanity was nothing more than a desperate hope in the mind of an impossibly ancient being. He had seen the Emperor at his most vulnerable, had witnessed moments of doubt and calculation and cold-blooded pragmatism that the Primarchs, with their filial devotion and their desperate need for paternal approval, would never be permitted to see. What did Valdor feel for the Emperor? Was it love? Could a being engineered for absolute loyalty experience something as messy and as human as love? Or was it something else, something colder and more precise? A recognition of purpose so total that it transcended emotion entirely. The novels suggest that the truth lies somewhere in between. Valdor served the Emperor not because he was programmed to, not because he was incapable of choosing otherwise, but because he understood, with a clarity that few others could match, the importance of what the Emperor was trying to accomplish. He served because he believed. And when that belief was shattered by the truths of the Apollonian spear, when the foundation of his existence cracked under the weight of knowledge he had never been meant to carry, the resulting crisis was not a malfunction. It was a heartbreak. Chris Raitt, who wrote the novel Valdor, Birth of the Imperium, captured something essential about the character when he portrayed Valdor as a being caught between two worlds. More than human but less than divine, capable of profound insight, but constrained by a purpose that left little room for personal expression. Valdor existed in a space between the mortal and the transcendent that was uniquely lonely. He could see further than almost anyone else in the Imperium, could understand complexities that would have overwhelmed lesser minds. Could perceive the shape of history as it was being made, but he could not escape the cage of his own creation. He was what the Emperor had made him, and no amount of knowledge or understanding could change that fundamental truth. Or could it? Perhaps that is the real question at the heart of the Valdor mystery, not where he went or what he is doing, but whether the most perfectly engineered warrior in history found a way to transcend his engineering, whether Constantin Valdor, crafted from infancy to be a weapon of absolute loyalty, discovered something in the truths of the Apollonian spear that allowed him to become something more, something that the Emperor never intended and the Imperium never anticipated, something that might, in the fullness of time, either save humanity or destroy it. What the future may hold. As we stand here, looking out across 10,000 years of mystery and silence, the question of Constantin Valdor remains as open and as compelling as it has ever been. The threads of his story reach forward into the current era of Warhammer 40,000 with a persistence that suggests they are far from being tied off. If anything, the evidence points toward a revelation that is still to come, a moment when the most mysterious custodian in the history of the Imperium will step out of the shadows and force the galaxy to confront the consequences of 10 millennia of corruption, a stagnation, and betrayal of the Emperor's original vision. The Bequin trilogy, when it reaches its conclusion with the long-anticipated final volume Pandemonium, may provide some of the answers we have been waiting for. Dan Abnett has spent decades weaving the threads of this story, building toward a revelation that has the potential to reshape the entire 40K setting. The King in Yellow, whether he is the original Valdor or a clone or something else entirely, Ed is sitting at the center of a web of mysteries that encompasses the Cogniti, the Grails, the language of Enuncia, the legacy of the Primarchs, and possibly the fate of the Emperor himself. There are those who believe that Valdor's return, if and when it happens, could trigger a second civil war within the Imperium. Consider the implications. Here is a being who predates the Primarchs, who served the Emperor more closely and more intimately than any of his gene sons, but who carries within his mind knowledge of the warp and the Emperor's true intentions that no one else in the galaxy possesses. If Valdor were to reappear and declare that the Imperium, as it exists, is a perversion of everything the Emperor fought for, the political and theological fallout would be catastrophic. The Ecclesiarchy, the Inquisition, the High Lords of Terror, all the institutions that derive their authority from the claim that they are carrying out the Emperor's will, all would suddenly find themselves challenged by a being who could credibly claim to know what the Emperor's will actually was. And then there is the question of Roboute Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, who has been resurrected and now serves as Lord Commander of the Imperium. Guilliman is himself deeply uncomfortable with the state of the Imperium. He is a rationalist and a pragmatist who finds the Emperor worship of the modern Imperium deeply distasteful, and who has struggled to reconcile the Imperium he helped to build with the grotesque caricature it has become. If Valdor were to reappear, Guilliman would find in him a potential ally, someone who shared his disillusionment and his desire for change. But he might also find a rival, a being whose claim to the Emperor's legacy is, in some ways, stronger than his own. And what of the Custodians themselves? How would they react to the return of their founding Captain General? With joy? Or with suspicion? With anger at his 10,000-year absence? The current Custodians have spent millennia defining themselves in the shadow of Valdor's legacy, measuring themselves against a standard they could never hope to meet. His return would force them to confront uncomfortable questions about their own identity and purpose, questions that have been deferred for so long that they have become almost impossible to answer. The mystery of Constantin Valdor is, in the end, yet a story about the cost of knowledge and the burden of perfection. It is about what happens when the most loyal servant discovers that the cause he served was not what he believed it to be. It is about the space between duty and conscience, between obedience and understanding, between the warrior who fights because he is told to, and the warrior who fights because he has chosen to. It is, ultimately, about what it means to be human in a universe that seems determined to crush humanity out of existence. Valdor was crafted to be perfect. He was engineered to be the ultimate expression of human potential, a warrior without flaw, a servant without doubt, a guardian without equal. And yet, in the end, it was precisely this perfection that drove him away. Because perfection cannot coexist with the messy, contradictory, heartbreaking reality of the 41st millennium. Because a being who was made to serve the Emperor's vision cannot stand silent while that vision is betrayed by the very people who claim to uphold it. Because sometimes, the most loyal thing a servant can do is to walk away from a master who can no longer speak for himself and try to fulfill the promise that the master's silence has left unfulfilled. Wherever Constantin Valdor is, whatever he is doing, whatever form his 10,000-year plan is taking, one thing seems certain. The story is not over. The first of the 10,000 has not laid down his spear, and when he finally steps back into the light, the galaxy will never be the same again. Thank you for listening to this deep dive into the mystery of Constantin Valdor, the most enigmatic custodian in the history of the Imperium. If this story stirred something in you, if it made you look at the golden warriors of the Emperor's household with new eyes, if it left you burning with questions about what comes next, Yeah, then do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring that notification bell so you do not miss the next time we journey into the darkness of the far future together. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and remember, in a galaxy of 10,000 mysteries, some answers are worth waiting 10,000 years to find.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.